Welcome to the Evolving Past Alzheimer's podcast, where we are focused on bringing you information to help prevent and reverse brain diseases like Alzheimer's and other dementias. I'm Dr. Nate Bergman, a functional medicine physician in Cleveland, Ohio, and your host on this journey. So, whether you're a baby boomer who's worried that your brain wiring just isn't working like it once was, or you have loved ones with the disease, or you yourself have already been diagnosed and are wondering, what do I do now? You'll want to listen to this podcast. Each episode, we introduce you to the top doers and thinkers that are revisioning Alzheimer's and dementia. If you have questions or comments or just want to connect, please check us out on our Facebook page, or if you're old-fashioned like me, Google Evolving Past Alzheimer's Podcast, and you'll find us that way. So here we go. Let's get better. Welcome back to the show. I am so excited to have our guest on today. I've been trying to get her on the show for almost a year, and we're finally able to get together. Sara Gottfried, MD, is a mother, wife, Harvard-educated physician, keynote speaker, and author of 3 New York Times best-selling books, The Hormone Cure, The Hormone Reset Diet, and her latest book, Younger, which was published last year. It's a breakthrough program to reset your genes, reverse aging, and turn back the clock 10 years. For the past 25 years or so, Dr. Sara has been dedicated to helping women feel at home in their bodies with functional medicine. She's got a very impressive pedigree. After graduating from Harvard Medical School and MIT, she completed her residency at the University of California at San Francisco, which is also a top 5 medical place in this country. She currently lives in Berkeley, California with her family. Welcome to the show, Sara.
Thank you, Dr. Bergman, Nate. So happy to be here.
Honestly, I've learned a lot from you, especially like when I was trying to get online with a lot of the hormone stuff and get other perspectives. Of course, I came from the perspective of traditional medicine, which is, at the time where I was being trained, the pendulum had swung back to like hormones are bad, don't give hormones, et cetera, et cetera. But my mother, who's also a physician, is sort of a fan and has led me to more of your work. And so I'm even more excited to have you on.
Oh, that's awesome. And thank you to your mother. She sounds like a cool woman.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Role model. Can you give us just a kind of a thumbnail on how you went from highbrowed East Coast Ivy League medicine to kind of what you're doing today in the Bay Area? The evolution of that, such an interesting contrast.
Sure. Well, certainly I'm so grateful for my education in Boston. It was an amazing experience. I learned so much at Harvard Medical School, especially about how to create your own conceptual model. Like how to take the science and really distill, discern, synthesize an original way of thinking about it. So that's what I got from Harvard. Super grateful for it. But after 5 years, I actually did a fellowship with the American Heart Association at the end of medical school. After 5 years in Boston, I was done with the weather. And I remember I went and interviewed for residencies in obstetrics and gynecology, which is what I'm board certified in. And it was a day in January, this was 1994, and it was 10 degrees in Boston. It had been about 10 degrees for, I think, a month. And I went to UCSF. I landed at the San Francisco airport, and it was 70 degrees and sunny. And so that pretty much sealed the deal in terms of moving to the West Coast. I had never lived in California. I just realized, if I don't have that much time off, I want the time off to be fabulous. I want to be able to go to the mountains and swim in the ocean. And so that got me to move there. But in terms of practicing functional medicine, which is, I think, what you're asking about as well, I grew up with a great grandmother who was a bit of a radical. I would say she practiced personalized lifestyle medicine before there was a name for it. And so she practiced yoga. She did it every day. She would show up at our house with suitcases of Whole Foods. She was a big fan of kale and wheatberry cookies, and she slept on a board. She didn't drink alcohol because she felt like it just didn't metabolize well in her body. And so I would say I grew up with this role model of functional medicine. But it wasn't until I came up against my own health crisis in my mid-30s that I really turned toward functional medicine.
I know there's some people that will be listening to this that are somewhat familiar with the story, but can you go into a little bit of what happened to you? Because, of course, that's, I think, the reason a lot of us that are practicing so-called functional medicine, that's how we get into it. It's just our own stuff. And I know that was the case for me. What happened to you?
Yeah, for me, I was in my mid-30s. I had one kid, and I was really struggling. So I was working full-time as an OBGYN. I was in mainstream medicine. In fact, I would even call it MIC medicine. I was seeing about 30 to 40
Medicine.
patients a day and delivering babies at
Dangerous.
night.
Practicing in a dangerous way.
Well,
It's like the dangers of seeing 30 to 40
yeah,
people a day.
I wouldn't say it was dangerous, but I would say that it was not the way I was trained. I was not able to provide the quality of care that I was trained to deliver in a 7-minute to 15-minute appointment. So, that created a lot of stress for me, but also I had a lot of hormonal changes that were happening in the background, and I didn't really have the tools to understand them. So I had PMS, I had this weight that I gained after having a baby and I couldn't lose it. I didn't want to have sex with my husband. I had all these symptoms, and I did what many people do. I went to my primary care doctor and said, listen, I just, I'm so old and cranky. I'm too young to feel this way. And
Yeah.
he suggested that I go on an antidepressant. He also suggested a birth control pill, because he said, that should solve your hormonal problems. And that
Right.
just rang hollow for me. I realized in that moment that so many people are being told this very same thing. I didn't feel depressed. I didn't feel like I needed a birth control pill. And so that's what led to me instead applying what I knew about the human body to myself, going to the lab, checking my hormones, realizing that my cortisol was 3 times what it should have been. My estrogen was way too high. My thyroid was low. And that was the root of why I felt so bad. So that's really what got me started.
And then did you end up using actual hormones, or were you able to do sort of not using hormones to get yourself better, or a combination?
Well, I would say initially I started to apply kind of the mainstream medical model to my own situation. So I looked at, what could help me here? Like, do I need to take estrogen? Do I need to take progesterone? And what I learned as I dived into the science is that taking the cart before the horse. And what I needed was to lay this foundation of lifestyle medicine first. So I needed to change the way I eat, move, think, and supplement in order to fix this particular problem, which in my case was hormones. For other people, it's Alzheimer's disease or dementia. So we all have, kind of our goals in terms of health. But I really learned that jumping straight to bioidentical hormones, for instance, was not the solution. I needed to lay this foundation first.
So you mentioned Alzheimer's and dementia, and certainly that's sort of the topic we're pretty focused on. You recently wrote an article on sort of estrogen and perimenopause in women and Alzheimer's. I think it was called Women, Perimenopause and Alzheimer's Disease, a call to action. And I recommend everybody read that. It doesn't take a long time to read, but can you sort of, from your perspective, lay out the issues? Because this is a controversial, to some degree, issue, the role of hormones, and should we be using things like estrogen or other things like you're mentioning? Can you kind of lay out the issues of estrogen, hormones, women, and perimenopause from your perspective, vis-a-vis brain health and Alzheimer's?
Sure, I'll do my best. I feel like it's such a juicy topic, but maybe
Yeah.
we can break it down. So we know that about 2/3 of the people with Alzheimer's disease are women. And that always gets my attention because I feel like women have certain vulnerabilities and I want to understand them because I then want to prevent Alzheimer's disease in women. So one of the vulnerabilities that we have is this dramatic hormonal change that we go through called perimenopause. And that typically happens in your 40s. For some women, it's in your 50s. And it's when you go from producing a fair amount of estrogen, progesterone, testosterone each month, kind of predictable sort of each day of the cycle, to producing very little. And the amount of estrogen that you make, if we just focus on that hormone for a moment, varies from person to person. But once you go through perimenopause, we know that this dramatic drop in your hormones, in your sex hormones in particular, is associated with a number of changes in the brain. So one of the dramatic changes that has been shown by Lisa Mosconi, for instance, is that you have something called hypometabolism in the brain. So women in perimenopause, as their estrogen levels are dropping, they are not able to move glucose around in the brain. Glucose is the primary fuel of the brain. And this seems to be associated with the increased vulnerability associated with Alzheimer's. So is it a direct cause? We don't really know the answer to that yet, but it's certainly a risk factor that we need to understand better. So estrogen, I would say, if we step back for a moment, I would say it's a master regulator in the brain and body for women. It's certainly a master bioenergetic regulator. And it's also involved in supporting the mitochondria in the brain. And so as estrogen starts to decline, it really affects the mitochondria. So I would say, those are some of the key issues. Another issue is ApoE4. The women who have one or two copies of ApoE4 have a much greater risk compared to men of developing Alzheimer's disease. So again, there's something different about women versus men that we need to understand. So I would say those are a few headlines. I'm happy to go further into any of those details.
Yeah, the concept of hypometabolism and glucose chondria, I thought was interesting the way you brought it out in the article, because certainly we know from Alzheimer's literature that before a lot of the classic changes are happening, beta amyloid proteins in the brain build up and the tau proteins that build up in the brain cells, neurons, many of the changes that happen before that, and we're starting to be able to describe that through doing spinal taps and checking cerebral spinal fluid, are in the mitochondria and are in inflammatory changes or are immune changes and are in the sort of support cells in the brain, the microglia type of cells. But can you say a little bit more about what's happening in this sort of hypometabolic stage of perimenopause, even, based on reading, what's happening actually in the brains of women that seem to be developing Alzheimer's, toxicity, oxidative stress, things like that?
Sure. Well, maybe what we could do is start with premenopausal women, because I think that's, kind of a good example of someone who's got things working properly. And we know that premenopausal women have mitochondria that are protected from amyloid beta toxicity. They also generate less of what I think of as rust or reactive oxygen species. So they have less oxidative stress. And if you look at those premenopausal women, even compared to age-matched men, they're better. So they have this greater protection compared to men that they then lose, presumably related to the hormonal changes of perimenopause. So I think that's one important piece of the puzzle. Another thing that we know is that women who have their ovaries removed, there's a number of brain changes that occur. And, if you look at the balance between the excitatory versus the inhibitory chemicals, they start to have changes. And it seems that tau protein, for instance, starts to increase in women who have their ovaries removed. So these are some of the examples of, pieces of the puzzle that kind of point to this bigger issue of what happens in the brain when you withdraw estrogen and these other hormones. I mean, we know, I'm talking about estrogen and progesterone here, but we also know that thyroid changes, cortisol changes, those also hugely impact the brain in both men and women.
Yeah, that's so interesting, because I was reading something a few months ago, looking at a little bit older literature. And I mean, older literature these days could be like 5 years ago, but I'm talking about like 11, 12 years ago. It was saying that when a woman goes through menopause, goes through the menopausal changes, and specifically estrogen drops, estrogen is a buffer against elevated cortisol and the changes associated with stress. And so having estrogen, more estrogen on board, if you will, may then lead to some of the protecting against the aspects you just mentioned of overexcitation and rust and oxidative stress. I guess one thing I'm always curious about is I see a lot of women that have been diagnosed with like early Alzheimer's, and I mean in their 50s and 60s, which, it's really early. If somebody has Alzheimer's in their 80, 83, 84, you say, okay, that maybe is sort of senile dementia, but Alzheimer's that's early, right? Like 50s and 60s. And so a feature that's not always there, but one thing that we notice in sort of real life, if you will, is that a lot of these women have had changes that had been called anxiety and depression, particularly anxiety during the perimenopausal period of their life. and were exactly like you mentioned that happened to you in your mid-30s or your 30s, was they were offered like an antidepressant. And it may have worked to sort of calm the nerves a little bit, but we wonder what's going on there. Why is it we call it anxiety and depression, but like sort of if you open under the hood and look at the physiology, what's happening that gives rise to those mood changes that are common enough? Maybe it's not hot flashes, but particularly like, anxiousness and depression. Do you have any thoughts around that, like particularly during that perimenopausal change?
Absolutely. I think this is a brilliant question, Nate. I'm so glad you asked it. In fact, I just wrote a book about it because I think this is such an important part of the story. So if we go back to the hormonal mess that I was in my 30s, I had anxiety and depression. And what I would say is that they were symptoms of an upstream problem. And by that, I mean the control system for my hormones was out of whack. So in medical language, we call that the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Some people extend it further to include the gonads and the thyroid, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal gonadal thyroid axis. But what was going on was that my HPA, my control system, was a total mess. It was dysregulated. And so in my practice with the 25,000 plus patients that I've seen since I started, I find that, somewhere around 80 to 90% of my patients have these symptoms that you're describing. They typically come to me in their 40s or 50s, in perimenopause or freshly in menopause, which is the date of the final menstrual period. And they have these symptoms of HPA dysregulation. So they have anxiety and depression. And unfortunately, I feel like anxiety and depression have been, they've been considered a disease in mainstream medicine, not a symptom of something upstream.
Yeah.
So I think you're absolutely right that there's something about the HPA regulation and how that almost gets unmasked in perimenopause and leads to an increased vulnerability to memory impairment, to dementia, to Alzheimer's disease, 10, 20 years down the road.
Absolutely. I've seen it enough now, like how we determine truth, if you will, in medicine is probably like other people. And I can't remember who I learned this from, but I'm sure I didn't make it up, is I like to see some data. It's nice when there's randomized control trial, at least there's something that physiologically makes sense in the textbooks or in articles, but it should also work in real life. I'm saying, like, if the criteria for the evidence was so narrow that it doesn't apply to 90% of people out there, it's like not very useful. And there's a surprising amount of stuff in the medical literature. It's like that.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. And there's not a lot of science on this particular issue of symptoms of anxiety and depression, for instance, for women in perimenopause, and how that then leads to an increased risk of Alzheimer's.
So let's go with that for a second. I'm sorry, go ahead.
But we know that women have a greater risk of HPA dysregulation compared to men. We know that they have double the rates of anxiety compared to men. We know that they have double the rates of depression compared to men. They have about double the rates of insomnia compared to men. And lo and behold, they have double the rates of Alzheimer's compared to men. So all these things kind of line up. And it's certainly been my experience in my clinical practice that I see this.
Yeah. So what do you do about it? You know what I mean? And I know that's like a crazy, broad question, but I mean, as you well know, as well as I, if not better, there's sort of high target things you mentioned. I forget the list that you mentioned, but how you moved, what you ate and slept, or I forget exactly and how you supplemented. I mean, there are some things that are important, but let's say, particularly in a perimenopausal stage where somebody might have a high risk copy, like an ApoE4. I actually saw a woman earlier this week, and she's got a double copy of ApoE4. I first started seeing her when she's 47 years old. She's now 50. And she was somebody that I tell her this every time I see her, like, she is going to have or will have had Alzheimer's probably young because everything was off the chain, like the eating, the sleeping, the stress. She owns, multiple businesses, and it's just like her stress is off the chain. Relationships are, she's improving. She continues to improve those things, but teenage kids, and she has really done a lot of work on sort of like what I call like basic things, just like food choices, trying to get more movement. She's supplementing differently, worked on the gut, and I mean, and she has had very significant changes. But I mean, sorry, she was like in almost a mild cognitive impairment stage when we first met her, when she's like 47 years old. Do you know what I mean? So like it's these perimenopausal women that where everybody's at risk, but certain people are at more risk. I guess how do you go through when you say, okay, what do I mean? Let me make the question of what to do about it clear. But who are the highest risk people from your point of view? And then what are the simple things that you feel like apply to everybody?
Sure. Yeah, that's also a great question. I would start first with the root cause. And with the patient that you described, or, there's even a woman who left a comment on the article that I have on my blog about perimenopause and Alzheimer's. I think when you have these symptoms of HPA dysregulation, often another root cause is inflammation. So I think that needs to be dealt with. And what I do, and what I imagine you do too, Nate, is I create a functional medicine protocol that's personalized for the person who's in front of me. So with someone who's an ApoE carrier, often it's informed by the Bredesen protocol, although I also refer out to people who are certified in his RECODE program. But there are basic things that you can do that can really help with inflammation and can help with the HPA dysregulation. So this woman that you described, 47-year-old, has a couple of teenage kids, and we know that combined with perimenopause is enough to make most of us insane. The things are, I start with food. I think food is the most important medicine. And so I look at what someone's eating, kind of where they are right now, and then where we want to go and what's realistic and how do we manage the change. So that's probably a bigger conversation. But I start with how you eat. And then I move to what are some of the nutrient gaps that exist and how can we address those? So that includes both with food and also with supplements as needed. And
how do you like to assess those nutrient gaps other than just asking somebody, well, what do you eat? Which is, of course, step one.
Yeah, so I like to look at a couple of things. I tend to do, can I mention a couple of labs?
Oh, yeah.
So I use the Genova NutriVal quite a bit in my practice. I look for nutrient gaps that way. I also do organic acid testing. And, another big part of inflammation, kind of the elephant in the room, is the microbiome. So I do some microbiome testing and we do what we can to optimize microbiome functioning. And then I also, I think it's important when you've got a 47-year-old woman who is stressed, up to her eyeballs, we've got to get her feeling better fast. Mm-hmm. And so I typically will give them an a la carte menu of ways that they can navigate stress differently. And, for me, it happens to be yoga and meditation. I know that's not the right fit for everyone. I think it's so important to really commit to some sort of practice. This is the stress management. As you mentioned earlier, you were talking about estrogen as a buffer to the stress, especially that women feel, and how, when you withdraw that in perimenopause, it just makes stress so much more difficult to manage and lead to a loss of stress resilience. And I would even take it further and say, I think of cortisol as a neurotoxin, meaning that if you've got too much of it, if your cortisol load is too high, it not only pokes holes in your gut and leads to leaky gut and dysbiosis and other problems, it also is potentially shrinking your hippocampus. So,
do you like to measure cortisol? Do you like,
yes. So I like to measure cortisol. I typically do, I do some blood testing because I love to build bridges with conventional and mainstream physicians. And so I always write, a referral note to the physicians that are involved in my patient's care. And so blood testing tends to be something that they can relate to. And then I also do some dried urine testing where I look at 4-point cortisol, I look at free and metabolized cortisol, and also estrogen metabolism.
What do you mean estrogen metabolism? Can you explain that a little bit more and why that might be important?
Sure. So, one of the things that happens in perimenopause is not necessarily that you stop making estrogen. It's not like this on off switch. What happens is you shift the type of estrogens that you make. So you go from making estrogen is kind of this big family of different types of estrogen. So estradiol is the main estrogen that you make when you're premenopausal, and then you make much less of it after you go through menopause. You also make estriol, which is known as E3. Estradiol is E2. And estriol is the main estrogen that you make when you're pregnant. Estrone is the primary estrogen that you make after menopause, and it is not protective, not like estradiol is. So one of the things I want to do with my patients is to look at how they're taking the estrogens in their body and breaking them down. So ideally, you want to use estradiol and then get rid of it. But what happens in a lot of women is that they have too much of various types of estrogen, and they keep recirculating it in their body over and over again, in part related to how much fiber they have in their diet, how much of a particular enzyme they're producing by their gut bacteria called beta-glucuronidase. And so we want to look at how estrogen is being used in the body and how the body is getting rid of it so that we can optimize it. On the other hand, if you don't do this, if you don't optimize the way that estrogen is being used in the body, it can increase your risk of certain estrogen-dependent conditions and diseases like breast cancer, endometrial cancer, endometriosis, even diabetes.
So let's say you look at these different species or different family members of estrogen, and you see that it's not in the balance or the proportions you are known to be more health promoting. What do you do about it?
Yeah, so that's where we use diet and supplements often to change the direction of estrogen metabolism. So, the average American woman gets about 14 grams of fiber a day. The amount that's recommended is double that. And if we go back to our Paleolithic ancestors, I don't know if you're a fan of ancestral diet, but they had 50 to 100 grams of fiber a day. Mm-hmm. So more fiber definitely helps with the golden rule of estrogen, which is that you use it once and you get rid of it. You don't keep recirculating it like bad karma. And then there's supplements that can really make a difference. You can eat magnesium-rich foods. You can get extra magnesium, which is what I need to do and the bulk of my patients need to do to help with getting the estrogen pathways to go down the protective direction. Another thing that helps is diindolylmethane. It's an extract of cruciferous vegetables.
Is that also known as DIM? D-I-M?
D-I-M. So it's like eating, 25 pounds of broccoli. Broccoli sprouts are also really helpful. So those are some of the basic things that I do. And, what we do is we personalize it. We figure out, okay, which are the estrogens we need to optimize, which ones are under our control, which ones are not.
Do you use B vitamins much? Do you recognize a role for so-called methylation?
Definitely.
In the hormone and estrogen story?
In terms of the effect, it's harder for me to see an effect on estrogen metabolism with B vitamins. I see it more playing a role in the foundation of, really using lifestyle medicine to address more basic issues, especially the cost of stress in the body. And, I feel like stress is such an important topic, and it's one of those things that just makes people's eyes glaze over. I don't know if you have that experience in your practice, right?
I could not agree with you more. Constant, it's become like stress and trauma are like the two mantras of the last year and a half in my world.
Yeah, it's like we've become inured to it, and yet I think it is so essential. And so, one of the things I tell my patients is that, listen, in 2009, Elizabeth Blackburn got the Nobel Prize for her work looking at premenopausal women and the role of perceived stress. And she looked at a group of women that had a sick kid, a kid with chronic disease, versus women who had a healthy kid. And she thought the women with the sick kid would be worse. She looked at their telomeres, which are these markers at the end of a chromosome that tell you biological age as opposed to chronological age. And she disproved her hypothesis. What she found was that it was the women with the highest perceived stress that were aging the fastest. And it wasn't, just like a few months or a few years. It was a 10-year difference based on perceived stress. So I use the same perceived stress scale that Elizabeth Blackburn used in her landmark study that led to the Nobel Prize with my patients so that they can really understand the role of their perceived stress in their estrogen metabolism, their B vitamin metabolism, their methylation, the way that their thyroid function is occurring, the way that the rest of their sex hormones like testosterone are working, because it plays such a fundamental role. So I went off on a tangent there with stress.
No, it's absolutely, we every, it's without it, we sort of kid about it, but like every single episode, we sort of come back to this. We had Grant Shields on and George Slavich, and we've had some people that their whole life is, stress research, the UCLA Stress Lab. And in Grant Shields' case, his whole thing is stress's impact on memory. It's been very enlightening for us, but screening for it and then like, what do you do about it? And one of the questions I have, and I discussed with Grant at some length, was, look, we live in a relatively enlightened time, at least in the United States. Like, I feel pretty, and it could just be where I come from, and where, there's certainly people where there's a lot of misfortune and want, and there's certainly a lot of disparity. But for those people that I see, for most of the people that I see are, I call them middle class socioeconomic and up. I mean, I definitely see people that are impoverished, but the majority of the people are sort of socioeconomically somewhere in the middle or in the top half. And then I see people, I see famous people and special for, you see athletes, and those people are like the most stressed, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So, but if you just take even the, kind of people that are sort of in the upper third of socioeconomic, like what they make, what they can afford, those types of things. And I think it's important to frame it that way. The perceived stress is like, hi, I learned in medical school being, don't be poor. Like literally, I remember the vice chair of the vice dean of the whole school got up and said, the biggest risk factor for all of the health problem, having every single health problem is being poor. So don't be poor, and then go help poor people, right? Like that was the message. And so certainly that's true. And those people never even make it to my office because there's so much challenge. But why do we have all this perceived stress? It's just like we're worried about losing something. I mean, do you have a perspective on this? I'm still searching for perspective here on if we have it so good, why is this still like the malady of our time?
Yeah, I'm not sure how to unpack that. I can give it a try, but I agree with you. I mean, I think we live in a time of abundance. We can eat whatever we want, whenever we want. And yet I would say from a functional medicine perspective, we're worse than we were 100 or 200 years ago. And so why is that? I do agree with you that I think there's something about socioeconomics and greater stress. I certainly see that with my wealthier patients. And it kind of tracks with, what I think is known about happiness. That, the people who are the happiest are the ones who are in the middle class, who have a household income of like $50,000 to $75,000 a year. And I don't mean to exclude people here, but that's, I believe, what the sociology research shows.
Yeah.
And I would say the same is true with cortisol and stress, that, the people who are in a lower socioeconomic group have greater cortisol and worse health outcomes. And I would say the people that are higher than that tend to have a lot more stress. And I think some of it comes down to money versus time. I think some of it also is related to how wired we are and social media, being always on, the digital age. I think that plays a role too. It's not the whole story, but I think that also plays an important role. And I think, often we just don't have good role models of how do you construct your life? How do you architect your life to really optimize the matrix? Maybe you learned that from your mother. I would actually like to hear about that. I learned it a bit from my great-grandmother.
Yeah. No, my mom is one of those people that type A, very, very high achiever. And sort of naturally, she went to medical school, and first she went nursing school, and then she didn't want to hear it from doctors because she figured I could do better, and then proceeded to do that. And then she went to residency, and then a few years in, she was like, she had me during medical school, and then my sister during residency. I was like, I want to raise children. Had 6 kids, and really kind of never looked back. But, she does everything. She does she does anything that you have read as this is a good thing to do, top to bottom. She'll do it. Diet, exercise, sleep, stress. You know what I mean? The whole gamut. And then, she supplements. I mean, she does really, really everything. Yeah. I mean, just seeing that. And also my dad also was always very conscientious about exercise, and I can take a chance to poke my dad here since you asked. Try to get him off some dairy and stuff. I think he feel even better if you get off some dairy and a little bit of the sugar. But very balanced. I mean, they're generally very balanced and they never neglected self-care, but it didn't become this sort of hedonistic thing that it seems to become for some people. Like there was just very balanced between family and work and just self-care. And so I feel fortunate in the fact that I had those role models in that regard. It was really, really positive.
Well, that's important. That probably gave you a model of wholeness that has allowed you to serve the people that you serve. I don't know what your dried urine testing looks like or your free metabolized cortisol, but
I'll show you mine if you show me yours. Right. So here's a question that I get. I think everybody gets, especially from people that are really new to the concepts you're talking about and the approach that you're talking about. And so let's say, somebody's doing the best they can in the life they do, and they're eating fast food once a week, and they're cooking 5 times a week, and they try to eat vegetables, and they don't have anything. They're not an alcoholic. They're not drinking 10 cups of coffee. There's nothing that's sort of terribly egregious about their diet. They exercise a couple times a week, but there's weeks that go by, but they haven't really, like you said, they haven't committed to it and really made it a practice. When you're counseling people, let's say to balance estrogen, or to if somebody's experiencing this sort of perimenopausal so-called anxiety and depression type of symptoms, how long, and this is certainly, I'm sure it's a range, but how long do you observe that it takes time to see changes? Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? And is it a long time, like years or months?
No. Well, I think definitely the more aggressive that you are with implementing a functional medicine protocol, the faster you're going to see results. It also depends on your starting point. So with this example patient that you gave, what I tell people is that it takes usually 6 to 12 weeks for your hormones to reset. We know that from decades and decades of research on hormones. But on the other hand, there are certain things that we can change inside of an hour. And so I'll tell you a couple of the supplements that my patients tell me gave them an immediate effect. It's not lasting. It's not, you take one supplement and you're better for the rest of your life. It tends to be, this is a bridge to a different way of constructing your life. So some of those supplements include phosphatidylserine.
How much? Like 103 times a day, or?
So I like to give somewhere around 300 to 400 milligrams. You can take it in divided doses. I often have women just take the full dose at night before they go to bed, because that's when they remember to take it.
Yeah.
The women who take it during the day, they tell me that, I called 7 girlfriends because this was so dramatic. So we know that phosphatidylserine lowers cortisol levels, and just, sometimes it lowers it below a threshold so that you feel like, oh, I got this. Like I feel like I can manage things again.
Yes.
Another one that I prescribe is something called Lavella, which is lavender, but in a pill form. I find that that's really helpful for anxiety.
Also at bedtime?
That you can take anytime during the day. You can take 1 or 2 pills. It's something you can get on Amazon.
Okay.
And then a third thing that I really love, and this is more for women in perimenopause who are still cycling, is chasteberry.
Mm-hmm.
So chasteberry helps to raise your body's progesterone levels. Progesterone is like nature's Xanax. And it's a neurosteroid that just really helps to soothe the female brain. And so I prescribe chasteberry to help. It's proven in more than 4 randomized trials to improve PMS. When it's given with St. John's wort, it's been shown to be especially efficacious in perimenopause. And that tends to take a little bit longer. It's not one of those things where you notice it within an hour. It takes typically 2 to 4 weeks to see a change. Well, I just want to add one. I think it's important that we acknowledge that as people who practice functional medicine, I haven't just switched my prescription pills for supplements. Like, this is in the context of the bigger picture of, taking this person, for instance, who is only having fast food once a week and is trying to increase their veggies, there's some other things I would want to do in terms of targeted lifestyle changes. Like, could we do a shake once a day? It's probably cheaper than eating the fast food, and it's so much better for your blood sugar, which also is an important piece of perimenopause. So there's some other things I would want to do. And then I'd also want to talk realistically about change management. Like, how much can you change over what period of time? How do we keep you accountable? Would it be helpful to work with a health coach? And, how do we make that really affordable and work for you? How do we, put this together in a collaborative model that's going to support the patient the best?
Absolutely. I want to circle back to the chaste berry. So that's CHASTE berry. Do you have a dose range that you prefer to use?
Yeah, the one that I tend to use in my practice is called Fertility Blend, and that scares off a lot of women who are in their 40s. But Fertility Blend is
that's a brand problem.
It's just a branding problem. It raises your serum progesterone as shown in a randomized trial at Stanford. So that's the one that I tend to use. And it's a proprietary blend, so I don't know the dose off the top of my head, but that's where I typically have people start.
Excellent. That's really helpful. So I would be, I know we're sort of coming to a close here, but I would be remiss to not ask you sort of the big elephant in the room's questions, which is, do you use actual hormones? Do you use estrogen and progesterone? And when do you move to those? I mean, in a general sense.
Yeah, that's a great question. So what I do is I have a progressive protocol that I use with my patients. So the first step is that we make targeted lifestyle changes, starting with diet, food first. And I think of diet not in kind of the restrictive way that it's come to be known these days. It's not a short-term means to an end, but rather the more ancient Greek concept of diet as a prescribed way of life. So we make targeted lifestyle changes. If that's in perimenopause, that would be, okay, we're going to increase your fiber. Let's go through your meal plan and see how we can adjust what you ate last week to make this week much better for your hormones. Here's the 3 things you're going to try to navigate stress. Let's take that, 4-cup a day coffee habit and swap it out for green tea. Let's add flax seeds to your shake. So that's step 1. Step 2 is botanical therapies that have been proven to make a difference. So we talked about chasteberry, for instance. Another one, especially for women who have already gone through menopause, is maca. And then a third herb that I like to use is Siberian rhubarb. So those are some of the botanicals that I use, and I sort of decide based on a patient's history and exam. And then the third
I have
step.
to say, I want to hear the third step, but I just want to plug here because I actually learned a lot about the botanicals from your books. So if anybody really has detail, there's a lot of detailed information on what, how much, what time, so and the hormone cure and is actually really good for that.
Yeah, thank you. So the third step, if those 2 steps don't address the symptoms that the patient is suffering with, and that typically, as I said, will take 4 to 6 weeks to reach a new place of homeostasis, then we move on to bioidentical hormones. But I have a particular way that I prescribe bioidentical hormones. I'm not the sort of person who, is heavy-handed with doses. I think people need to find the smallest dose that addresses their symptoms and, kind of optimizes their matrix. And ideally for the shortest length of time. And that's based on the best evidence. So my way of prescribing hormones is a little bit different than others. And, a typical thing that I'll do for someone who's early in menopause or late in perimenopause is to use an estradiol patch, not at the full dose, but at, for instance, 0.0375 milligrams with micronized progesterone like Prometrium at night. So that's an example of how I get to the bioidentical hormones.
And what are your feelings? And so again, this is like Dr. Gottfried saying, this is really uncharted territory. We have, with some of the KEEPS trial and the Women's Health Initiative, some of the big landmark trials that are being analyzed and reanalyzed and reanalyzed, and they're sort of tracking results further and further out now. So there isn't really an answer here. But the North American, as you well know, the North American Menopause Society last year came out with some guidelines in 2017, and essentially saying that really, I think the words were usually women over 60 or 10 years post-menopause should not be prescribed hormone replacement therapy. So mostly talking about estrogen and also making reference to progesterone. I think there's two pieces to this. One is, do you agree with that?
Mm-hmm.
And I'll
Well,
ask my second question based on your answer.
okay. So I'll answer the first question. So I agree with this in theory. And I think definitely hormone therapy is still very controversial. Before 2012, 22% of American women were taking hormone therapy. And after 2002, it dropped to 5%. And I think in some ways that's unfortunate because I think the right answer is probably in the middle of those two extremes. And I think a lot of women are suffering unnecessarily. So with the 2017 consensus that you're talking about, what they're basically saying is we should treat women who are in perimenopause and menopause within the first 10 years of their last menstrual period and to know that it's safe. After that, so they're saying, for instance, after the age of 60, since the mean age of menopause is 51, we think it could be dangerous and provocative. So in theory, I agree with that. My way of deciding whether someone is a good candidate for taking hormone therapy is a little bit more involved than, do you have symptoms of perimenopause? Okay, here's a prescription for estrogen and progesterone. I like to look at, the bigger story of what's happening with your detoxification. How are you metabolizing estrogen? What's going on with your microbiome? Are you getting all the foods that you need? Are you not eating the foods that cause problems with your hormones, like sugar and alcohol?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's really valuable to sometimes do some genomic testing to say, okay, what's your risk of having a blood clot? What's your risk of having a stroke? What's your risk of having a cardiovascular event?
Mm-hmm.
So I do think within 10 years, the data is quite solid. We still have a lot of unanswered questions, especially about cognitive function. And is that the window where estrogen as a master regulator is going to have the biggest impact? And then after that, it has no effect at all. So we
Yeah.
still have some unanswered questions, but that's basically how I approach that
So,
issue.
the so-called critical window, Roberta Brinton and others are sort of putting forth. Roberta Brinton at USC and Utah, of course. So
Yes.
she, the way that Dr. Brinton puts it, it's almost like you're using estrogen preventively, especially for women that are at higher risk. It would be like estrogen as a prevention. And that, of course, is absolutely not the standard of care. And I hope nobody gets the idea listening to this that, everybody should have estrogen as a prevention for Alzheimer's. This is absolutely unproven. It's a hypothesis. But there is some, there are not just her, there's others that are sort of putting work, and you need, long-term data to really make hard conclusions on this. But I guess from your, just from having seen patients for 25 years and been open to using hormone replacement therapy, meaning using estrogen and progesterone thoughtfully, what do you actually see? You know what I'm saying? What do you see women's brains go on when you start hormones, and how often?
Yeah, so what I actually see is that about 10% of my patients in perimenopause and menopause end up deciding to go on hormone therapy. So I'm in between those two extremes that I mentioned of,
Mm-hmm.
22% before 2002 and 5% afterwards. And in terms of, I would call this expert opinion, which is like the lowest quality evidence,
But evidence
anecdotal
nonetheless.
evidence.
But evidence nonetheless. I mean, I don't think we can just ignore expert opinion, especially people who are doing this for years and years and are thoughtful and have been tenacious about keeping up with the literature. You know what I'm saying? Like, until you have a randomized control, I think it still is a level of evidence.
It's a level of evidence. And what I can tell you is that the picture is mixed, which tells me that we probably don't know all of the levers at play here. So I have, probably about a third of my patients, I'll put them on hormone therapy. They have an immediate dramatic reaction. They start giggling for the first time,
Mm-hmm.
in 10 years. They feel like their libido is better. They feel like their processing speed and their brain is faster. They are able to focus for the first time in years. So I have, about a third will have that kind of dramatic difference. One third doesn't notice much of a difference. Maybe the hot flashes, the night sweats are better, but otherwise not noticing much. And one third has, doesn't feel good on it. or, we have to tinker with the dose, or we have to figure out what else still needs to be addressed in their matrix. So that's kind of, what I see clinically, and the way I phrase it for my patients. And I think, maybe this will be helpful for our listeners, is I tell them, listen, the state of hormone therapy is just a mess. Like, there's so much controversy about it, especially when it comes to the brain and Alzheimer's and the critical window. So you have to look at this as an experiment. And so if we get to the point where they're trying hormone therapy, they've already laid the foundation of lifestyle medicine, and they've kind of optimized whatever they could with the way they eat, move, think, and supplement. And we embark on hormone therapy together. I tell them, listen, look at this as a 3 to 6 month experiment where we're going to track certain things like your brain function, your libido, your skin and how it looks to you, your vagina, and how much dryness you have. And so, we'll figure out what our symptoms are and then track those over 3 to 6 months to see if it's making a difference, if it's worth, the potential risks. And again, we try to optimize those by doing some genomic testing. But I really consider this kind of a risk-benefit alternative discussion.
That's great. How long do you wait? I mean, what do you think is sort of a reasonable window of time once you feel like you've started hormone replacement therapy, estrogen, progesterone in particular? How long do you wait before you make a determination where this just isn't helping? I mean, 3 months, 6 months, a year, and you've sort of tweaked the doses as well, where you're thinking, all right, we should have seen a result at this point. And if you're not having a positive, if there isn't a benefit, then there's only risk. How long do you wait for that? And I'm sure, again, maybe it's variable, but, range, I guess. Do you have a range?
Yeah, I would say 6 to 12 months. I think that's how long it takes to reach homeostasis once you've optimized dose and you're kind of tracking the symptoms that somebody has.
Okay. And do you view there is an exception to the general rule? And again, I think the NAMS guidelines was usually women over 60 shouldn't be starting or be on hormone replacement. But I mean, have you seen cases of exceptions to that rule where people continue to do well, especially from a cognitive or mood sort of symptom perspective, and their body sort of required continuous estrogen and progesterone over the age of 60 or 10 years past menopause?
I do. And I feel like this potentially could get me into trouble, but I'm a troublemaker, so I might as well just say it.
Right.
So
you're in good company here. It's okay.
I had a feeling. So yes, I would say, this is the minority of my patients, and they get so much counseling from me about the potential risks of continuing hormone therapy beyond age 60 that they basically could write an article on it. But that aside, to me, I feel like my job is to give extensive informed consent so that every woman in my practice is aware of the very current risk, benefit, and alternatives of hormone therapy as of, my latest lit search, which usually was within a week.
Yeah,
and so to me, it's an ongoing negotiation. That said, a lot of my patients are scared. And so after 60, with, even with the data that we have with the devil we know, Premarin and Provera from the Women's Health Initiative,
right,
they're scared. And so they stop their bioidentical hormone therapy at 60 or 10 years after menopause. But then I also have women who say to me, Dr. Sara, my quality of life, my brain function, my libido is so much better on hormone therapy versus not on hormone therapy that I, at age 65, consent to continue hormone therapy.
So that's a shared decision, right? Yeah, I mean, the days of paternalistic medicine, you take this or, those are long gone. I mean, these are shared decisions. And I feel like, if as long as somebody has more than 7 to 12 minutes, like you mentioned at the beginning of the interview, to have a conversation about these important things, you can really impact people's lives. And you're more likely to make the best decision for this individual.
That's right. And, the data does change a fair amount. We learn more and more about estrogen and its role in regulating the female brain. And this is not the sort of thing where I write a prescription and then I refill it every year and don't see the patient. When someone's stable on hormone therapy, I typically see them every 3 to 6 months so that we can renegotiate and kind of figure out, okay, is this something we want to continue?
Absolutely. Hey, thank you so much for your time. You mentioned a book. Is that something you want to mention more, or is that like on lockdown?
It's a little bit on lockdown, but you got me talking here, so I might as well just mention it. So I don't even know if it's available yet on Amazon, but it will be soon. It's called The Brain-Body Diet. So it's about the brain-body connection in the female body. And this is the use of the word diet, as I talked about, kind of the ancient Greek concept of a prescribed way of living, not a restrictive diet. So it's a functional medicine approach to the brain-body connection for women.
Okay, and certainly anybody can Google your name, but best way to connect with sort of all your knowledge, programs, etc., is
SaraGottfriedMD.com.
Dr. Sara, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate your generosity with your time and your wisdom.
Thank you, Nate. So happy to be with
you. So that's our episode. I hope you guys got something out of that. Check the show notes out on iTunes or on our website where we've summarized the key points. If you have questions or comments or just want to connect, please check us out on our Facebook page. Or if you're old-fashioned like me, Google Evolving Past Alzheimer's Podcast, and you'll find us that way. Finally, if you find the information here valuable, please consider giving us a 5-star rating on iTunes and leaving comments in the comment section. It will really help us bring this message to as many people as we can. Thanks, and talk to you next time.